Our first guest lecture for this academic year, and I just said the sounds of the underground, it was of course programmed, will deal, I suspect, to a large degree with earth-covered underground architecture. It is a real pleasure to introduce to you William Morgan, architect from Jacksonville, Florida, who found much public attention in the architectural journals. You saw some of his underground projects particularly published on various title pages, AIA Journal, PA, and so forth. I would like just introducing him, mention some few things in his vita. Born in Jacksonville, Florida, he still practices there. However, he is probably one of the architects who traveled extensively, had quite a bit of exposure, studied at Harvard, and when I asked him, how did you get into underground architecture, he told me, and that was quite a few years ago, when I was in school, when I studied there, my professors advised me really not get into something exotic like underground architecture. Since the professors really didn't like it, I thought that sure must be an interesting thing. So that's how Mr. Morgan got interested in underground architecture. There are other reasons, I think, and he will explain some of it in his lecture. He became a fellow of the American Institute of Architects because of excellence in design in this particular category, received a number of awards for excellence in design. One of the recent things, something like which is called a mid-career grant, he received 2 years ago and is currently working on a project related to underground architecture. He currently is putting finishing touches to 2 publications. One book published by MIT Press will be available at the bookstore. I don't know if it will be at the Ball State bookstore, but will be nationally available sometimes next summer. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce to you Bill Morgan, our lecturer for tonight, who will talk about works in progress. Bill? Thank you.
How about now? Good. Can everyone hear now? No? Well, I'll try to hold it up like that. How about that? Well, thank you very much for having me here at Ball State. It's my first trip to Muncie. I have had the pleasure of being in Indianapolis and in other parts of the state before. But I thought maybe if I could, I'd like to share with you tonight some of the things that I'm very interested in, that the architects in my office are very interested in, some things we've been doing. And I think that the times we live in today have been variously referred to by all sorts of catchy names and phrases, all of which I will shy away from. But I do think there's an underlying thing that we're going to see tonight that has to do with one of the several versions, the several approaches, the several methods, the several possibilities that is abreast in the land today. We've got a lot of different ways that we can approach things. And tonight we're going to try to take a look at one particular approach. If I could turn the lights down, please. Thank you. And would you please let me know if the traffic noise in the background is too much? I know it's a bit warm, so we're going to try to leave the door open. would be all right with you. What we're seeing here is a view of the world. We're looking down from a space capsule. We've just gone off from Cape Kennedy. The peninsula of Florida is seen here from several miles up. We can see the curvature of the Earth in the background. We're looking across the Isthmus of Panama in Mexico, and we can see the curvature of the Pacific Ocean in the background. A few years ago, to the generations of your parents and their parents, such views of the world were impossible. It was very difficult to even imagine in a wireless, Jules Verne sort of world that anything like that would ever come to pass. And today we find ourselves as practitioners, and particularly you as young people, as we close the 70s and we enter the decade of the 80s, we move toward the year 2000, toward the 21st century, and we're finding out that of all the new views there are in the world, we've only begun to find a few. The underlying beauty of the earth that I think really is part of man's environment, although ours is the built environment, that of architecture, landscape architecture, and planning, I think it's the world of nature and of man brought together in some sort of harmony, some understanding that really could mean a great deal of value. Have something to say to us tomorrow. Here's the interface of the sea and the land, and in this case rocks and sometimes sand. And much of our nation of America is covered with beautiful forests. And we wonder what, as the custodians of our beautiful environment, we're doing with all those natural beauties. And I'm afraid the record from my point of view is really not too good in a lot of respects. I think in many cases we're taking fossil fuels and ores from the earth, and we're combining them with all sorts of energy waste, and coming up with a world that we really are beginning to question, and I think it's a very lucky thing for us that we are. The environment of beauty that we found here in America when our forefathers as Europeans for the most part came here was one that was quite beautiful, and yet today we find ourselves in a technological jungle. So what I'm going to be doing now is to invite some other possibilities, some other approaches, ask some other questions about what we could do. This is a view of the Florida State Museum, a building that was designed in our firm about 10 years ago now, about a decade ago. The building is being seen here as we approach it from a little valley. This is in central Florida. Hills of any kind are very rare in Florida, and we celebrated the hillside here by creating a series of terraces and using earth-insulated berms to surround the building. And as a matter of fact, now the telemetry equipment has measured the amount of energy that the building uses over a period of 7 years precisely. It turns out to use about 38% of the normal energy requirement of any building. Now, remember, this was designed before there was an energy consciousness very broadly. The reason that we did it here was primarily to save all the money that we could for the acquisitions the museum to spend as little as possible for the architecture. The bridgeway for the pedestrians that you saw in the prior slide, and these terraces that we created outside of the 2-acre plaza courtyard that we devised here, are really a series of sculptures. They're a series of masses, of terraces, of truncated pyramids. They become part of the building, and the building becomes part of them, and we never know exactly where the one is beginning and the other is ending. There's a kind of a continuity between the outside and the inside. Here's a view of the museum from its upslope. I think you would agree with me that it's far from being pretentious. It's a very quiet building. If anything, it seems to be little more than the extension of the landscape. After so many assertions on the campus here at the University of Florida, it seems to me to be something of a relief not to have a building that pushes itself off on us. A building that we designed a year or two later is this hilltop residence in Central Florida. The residence was thought of as a kind of a volcano. We took the hill and took the very top of the hill, and rather than leveling it flat or setting up a building on top, we took it and shaped the very hilltop, sort of opening up the crater of a volcano and then forming incisions into the walls of the truncated pyramid that resulted. Looking across the experimental orange grove here in the foreground, we see the hilltop from the distance. It's a barely perceptible hill, but it is about 230 feet above the surrounding terrain. From the downslope, looking back toward the residence, we see a pavilion on top, which is very open all the way around, and down below, in this particular case, are two bedrooms which are nestled into the earth. It's a very quiet outlook from these spaces. Here's a living room, the lower salon area for the owner. Looks like a very quiet terrace. There is several miles away an expressway, which does make some noise, but acoustically this is a very quiet and insulated space. The owner's desk is shown here on the very top of the pyramid. This is his pavilion. He has a very large family now. We're not able to disclose his name or the exact location of the project, but he now has 32 children and grandchildren. And this is a great sort of assembly room in which they can, a couple of times a year, all find themselves together. The owner loves this room very much. He can go out on this veranda, even see from his desk all the land that is around him. And it's very comforting to him to know that he owns all of it. We don't have many clients like that. This is a very different approach from the most exotic and type of thing that you could do to a very workaday kind of condition. This is a typical, happens to be in South Florida near Miami, office complex. I'm sure you would find many of them right here in the central Indiana area. It's a very simple series of buildings. They're all office complexes, speculatively built. The building that we're seeing in the middle ground to the right is a four-story office building. And then we're seeing closer to our left a one-story building, and it's elevated on an earthen berm. The berm does two things for us. It lifts us above a floodplain. This is a very low-lying terrain, and the torrential thunderstorms there sometimes flood out the streets and can flood out buildings too. So we lift it in that way, but it also separates the pedestrian world from the world of the vehicle, and it gives man a special place to be. And in the suburban asphalt, sometimes that's a welcome relief. There are very quiet steps that lead us into the interiors of the buildings, and as you can see, curious things happening about the buildings. They're beginning to disappear. They're becoming less and less important, and what is important is where people walk and move, and trees and gardens, and pleasant places for you to sit outside and drink your lunch, or the secretaries to gather and things like that. The buildings themselves, that are very close all around us, are played down to a very great extent. And the whole idea of creating a wonderful world for human beings is the primary emphasis. A different project entirely is this Oceanside, Ocean City, Maryland condominium. The density is exceedingly high, 72.5 dwelling units per acre, and all surface parking. And the outlook to the left, if you can see it, there's a horizon there, that's the Atlantic Ocean. And we're seeing a building that's somewhat pyramidal in shape. Its principal compositional elements are a series of, from this view, the great elevator shaft to the right, to the left, a series of balconies that step back, and toward the center, access ways, which do serve as fire egresses and that sort of thing, but also become sunshades and become balcony extensions for the end units of the project. They in and of themselves, not by adding anything decorative to the building, but simply by being clearly expressed, tell us a great deal about the building, about how it works, how we move through it, how we go up and down the stairs and move horizontally through the building to the elevator shaft. Looking back from the beach, we can see the very simple shape of the building. It steps back in an almost pyramidal form. It gives a minimum shadow in the afternoon, in fact all day long. The shadow seems to be thrown upon itself rather than upon the beach. And on the relatively short winter of the middle Atlantic coast, it's very pleasant not to have big towering buildings that almost block out the sun in the afternoon. In the evening, and this is taken during a smog, not a smog, a fog, I'm sorry. It was moving in one morning, and the eerie light in the background is the dawn, and we're seeing at the very top of the great elevator shaft is a single large light. We had the problem of getting a sufficient parking lot illumination level, and of course we have always the problem of the cobra heads, that is the lighting standards that stand around there and take on very important design presences themselves. And what we did was to take all of the light and put it together into a single great oculus at the top of the shaft, and we found that we use about half the power at half the cost. And it becomes a decorative feature in itself, like a beacon, almost like the prow of a Viking ship that comes up from the sea. The vertical twinklings of lights there that you see, the vertical shafts, mark the entryways to each of the units. Again, it's a functional description of the way the building is used, the way the main entry doors occur. But when taken together in the total composition, the building takes on a special nature of its own and expresses itself as something of a rather remarkable character. Another approach to working with man's built environment that we're very interested in is this building here. We're seeing the old courthouse, the white painted arches below with the Coca-Cola signs and so forth, and up above was an old, above the livery stable was an old printing loft built about 1902 in downtown Jacksonville. About 5 years ago, our firm bought that building and converted it. The livery stable down below is now a parking area, and up above the printing loft has been converted into office space. This happens to be the lobby of our offices. Mostly it's professional people, particularly attorneys groups, who work at the nearby or have dealings with the nearby City Hall. You can see that the loft of the printing gallery here was expressed, the brick walls being expressed for precisely what they do. Everything possible that could be saved was saved, and it was expressed for exactly what it is. We introduced skylights in our office area, our working area, which you can see here in the loft, and trying to emphasize natural light as much as possible. Within the building, the old trusses and the overhead, you can see the beams and the truss to the left work very well for the attorneys' offices here that are built within the building. We have about 9,000 square feet of attorneys' rental office space here, and it has worked out, I might say, very well economically. Surprised us. The project that we see here was done chronologically about the same time that the remodeled stable was underway in the office. This is the shaping of an earthen hill in Biscayne Bay, which is North Miami. The project, which is not going to be built, was part of a larger Interrama area development and international trade center. This is a 6,000-seat auditorium, which was actually constructed or conceived of as being a great artificial hill. You can see to the great canopy in the center there. To the right is a floating stage that is retractable to permit water ski shows to come very close And then when the stage is required, the stage barge floats out, guided by an underwater railroad. In the very foreground is a restaurant and bar that looks out over the bay, seating about 300 people. A series of very broad ramps come up in a very almost accidental quality. Since it was being shaped, the earth itself, the hill was created. It was all shaped by man, but we did it in a very easy and gentle way, an almost accidental fashion for the entire building. But the roof, nonetheless, takes on a very mechanical repetition of almost identical forms. It's the Teflon-coated fiberglass. The spans from right to left are about 550 feet, and that's right to left, and then up to down about 220 feet. This would have been one of the largest tensile roofs that would have been constructed in the world. The diagram here, this is our computer printout, by the way, which is one of the ways that we use in designing structures, particularly when they become complex like this roof. That is the cable diagram for the cable stress-relieving cables. As you can see, the repetitions, we're seeing 5 repeated one after another, and the cable points themselves are points of maximum stress. The panels are infilled by the fiberglass. It strikes me that this diagram, although it's only in one way a kind of an engineering diagram, it is, on the other hand, something of it seems to me a very beautiful design in itself. It represents a kind of a harmony that we seem to seek between the necessities of structure and the very beautiful alternatives of architecture, trying to find a harmony between the two, trying to find a consonance and a meaning and a belonging of the two. Seen from the water across the bay, we can see 3 jewel box-like glass enclosures. They contain organ lofts and projection booths and things like that. The retractable stage is to the right. The building was built to withstand 210-mile-an-hour hurricanes, which is a very substantial horizontal force on a building. Some distance up the coast in Atlantic Beach, Florida, is my residence, which is shown here. The residence is built on a series of levels, stepping up the face of a sand dune. On the lowestmost floor are what we call the wet room, where the ocean is actually welcome to come in should a storm tide ever rise that high. This is where the ping pong table and the Hobie cat and things like that, a catamaran sailboat, are stored. A central stair leads to our son's bedrooms on either side, up to the public areas, and finally to the loft, where the master bedroom, dressing, and studio are inside. This is a view of the same structure from the upslope looking down. This is the one that we show the tax assessor. The carports are to the right and left on the left-hand side of the screen, the entry being directly in the middle. It's a very quiet building. It's shaped, the siding, which is diagonal, is structural. It's a hurricane-resistive diaphragm at the end walls to resist some of the terrific windstorms that we have. And the interiors are expressed again in terms of wood for exactly what they are. You're seeing sort of one level after another here. This is the dining and kitchen in the foreground, looking across to the living room in the background, the fireplace on the left, and the studio up above overlooking it. The whole building in its series of terraces is modeled after a town that I like very much, a whole town plan. It's Ercolano, or Herculaneum. It's a town in Rome, or near Rome, in Italy of the Roman times, which was designed exactly like this. The main plaza level, and then down below is a place for changing togas, and then up above is a place for the residences of the seaside community. Going down to the garden, we're going out there in the distance, we can see the catamaran on the right and the barbecue pit and a series of benches and all those things. We created an oasis by the sea, placing earthen pyramids of grass and a grouping palm trees, all of which were transplanted, and creating a garden that would survive the northeast storms of the Atlantic coast, and altogether finding a way to make a very special place for being somewhere by the sea and near the beach, which has a very high glare. It's an attempt to be out of doors and at the same time to have a sense of being in a place. And I think that's indicative of our work. What we seek is something that celebrates the existence and the pattern of function of, in this case, of a family, or in the case of the people who use the building. Something that architecture can do to enhance those daily activities of life. Between the palm trees, if we look slightly to the south and back inshore, we'd see nestled into the same sand dune these two round openings. There are two one-bedroom apartments. As we come closer to them, we see the gunite shell interiors opening up, and we see the single large space that is the typical living unit. The one is simply the right hand of the other, the opposite hand of the other. The interiors show the great bearing shell, that is the expression of gunite, of concrete for what it is, to hold back the pressure of the earth coming down on top of it. And then inside, those elements that do not bear are made of wood, and they are expressed exactly as being non-bearing and being made of wood. Even the stairs are separated by light from the shell, so that there can be no mistake that about what is supporting and what is not supporting. The space here is almost a perfect cube, its height being equal almost precisely to the width and almost the same to the depth. The oversized stairs and their curving outward thrust as they come to their base might be familiar to you, those of you who might be interested in history, and you remember the Laurentian Library by Michelangelo, which was also an oversized stair and an almost perfect cube of space. Looking back out through the sunken built-in couch, we look out toward the sea, and you get some idea, some feeling, I think, here. We built this ourselves several years ago to try to find out the answers to several questions. Many of our clients have asked us about living underground, and they ask us, among other things, if it might not have a feeling of being sort of claustrophobic, that is, of having the earth pressing down on you. And I must say that it's anything but that. We have yet to have such a reaction from one of the tenants who's lived there. By the way, 6 couples have been living there now for a period of almost 4 years, but not all at once. But the entryway here is sort of an areaway. The curves that you're seeing, again, are not, although I find them personally very pleasant, they're not only shaped to be beautiful, although we did have quite a few arguments with the computer, and we just kept reprogramming it until the curves got to be more like the things we'd like to see. But they actually are working. They're holding back the earth. They're supporting each other. They're resolving the edges of the shell, which is a very critical point in the structural design, so that the curves themselves and the masonry itself all becomes expressive of a very necessary supportive function to the architecture as a whole. A short distance south on the coast is this truncated pyramid, which is the Makandishi residence facing eastward toward the Atlantic Ocean, which we see at the top of the screen. The forecourt is an entry court for automobiles to park, the garages to the right and left, and the residence itself is directly ahead. Looking back from the sea, we see a great insect screen enclosure The insect screen is of a very special type, which has a solar reflective quality, that is, rather a solar blocking quality, so that we can minimize the heat gain in our swimming pool area on that elevation of the residence. To the right and left, access ways lead into gardens in which we store surfboards and hang out towels and wet bathing suits and things like that. On the interior, looking toward the sea, the swimming pool, we can see the light is on in the evening here. A clear story light at the very top emphasizes the height, the vertical dimension of the interior space, which is at this point almost 2.5 stories high. We're looking down into the living room, the dining room being closest to us in the foreground. In the evening, as we are out under the screen enclosure, we see the swimming pool to the right, seating areas in the middle of the picture, and to the left is the living areas. Another project in Atlantic Beach is this group of cluster housing. It's a condominium grouping, 15 units on a very modest site. I think it's another indication of our office's very strong concern for environmental preservation and for the celebration of nature for what it is, and the attempt to find a harmony between man that represents the ocean. There's an immense sand dune that projects upward, and it's covered with very beautiful natural oaks, trees, natural foliage. And so our determination was that rather than building all over the site, that we would take the density, 20 units per acre, and build it all in one concentrated area to the west of the site, leaving the dune as a preserved area and creating nature paths and walks and decks and things like that in between the beach and the inshore development. All of the roofs slope in such a way that clerestory lights are developed to introduce light from the north, which in our particular area has maximum light benefit. The quality of the north light is very fine. It's almost uniform. At the same time, we don't have a tremendous heat gain problem. There's also a very consistent concern expressed here. Perhaps you can see the grouping lends itself to a great circular turnaround, a drive that goes back out so that emergency vehicles and so forth can get access to every residence. But at the same time, there's a graduation of 3 types of area. The one is public, that is the street itself. The second is semi-public, in which we make the transitions into private garden areas and into individual carports and so forth. And finally, the third is entirely interior and entirely private. So there are this hierarchy of spaces that belong to the community as a whole, that belong in a limited respect to one's neighbors and oneself, and then finally the residence of man himself. The materials that are used in the project are entirely natural materials. They're repeated entirely. There's an utter consistency that runs throughout the entire project. The individual walled gardens become a part and extensions of the main living unit walls, and you can see that by the staggering of the units, the setting forward and stepping back, that we're able to assure a substantial amount of privacy, although it's a very high density. Every attempt has been made by building the building slightly off-grade. Thereby, we were able to preserve the undulation of the terrain and a maximum number of the trees and the foliage that was growing on the site. The interior spaces, again, are marked by the vertical space and its defining vertical planes. This is a characteristic of our work, and it recurs quite frequently. At some point in the building, one can always tell what its maximum dimensions are. That is, you can see it. You can see here exactly how far up inside the building goes vertically. You can measure it with your eye. And the unifying space becomes this very high ceiling living room area. We're working on another project at this time, of which only the first phase is now nearing completion, and that is a community for elderly persons. It's a project that will finally have about 400 housing units available, and the central facility that we're seeing here is contains a central dining facility, an infirmary, and intensive care units for the residents of the community. It's in Asheville, North Carolina, in a very mountainous area. The challenge that was brought to us here, first of all, was the very great difficulty of finding a place in this mountainside without flattening the mountain, in which we could afford pleasant living areas for people. And what we would like to do is to put them, and we have, in close walking proximity to a central facility, at the same time to preserve to the greatest extent the surrounding mountainside. Well, what we found was two canyons, as it were, two little valleys. And if you can see at the very top of your screen, there are two small pools, one to the upper right, the other to the upper left. And then there are brooks that come down to the big pool that show a great pond or lake that's shown in the center of the screen. The elevation between those two heights is about 40 feet. That is, it drops 40 feet in a relatively short distance, and it comes down with sort of like a cataract with a crashing sound of water. It's a very pleasant area. These are the first units that have just been completed. You might see that the bridgeway is leaded across to the upper, typical upper living quarters. They're one-bedroom units, basically, and then there are ramps that lead down in the valley to the lower level of each of the units. By making all of the units 2 stories high, we were able to stay within a very, very tight budget. At the same time, we were able to reduce visually the number of units that we were working with, so that instead of working with 400 units, we now are working with only 200 visual units, and it's something that made the whole task a little easier. In the center, behind one of the central roofs there, you can probably see the upper pond, which we're stocking with fish, so that the residents can go fishing in the evening. The stream is fed by natural water, natural springs, I mean, and we're looking out here at some of the rolling terrain. There's a view up from the interior of the stream. It's looking back up toward the units. They're nearing completion here, not yet quite complete. Another project that we have recently completed is this house in Central Florida it's the Dickinson residence near Gainesville, Florida. Here is a 60-acre oak grove and very gently sloping site. And the thing that we wanted to do very much here was to preserve as many of the great trees as we could, and at the same time, the owner wanted us to develop an extremely energy-efficient house for his retirement residence. The program consisted of, at the lower portion of the screen, a so-called barn. It's a 2-car garage with an overly deep area for storing the retiring couple's many lifelong accumulations, and then a link that leads to a larger structure, both being truncated pyramids, both earth encased. And then finally we see upward projecting towers, light scoops, ventilation scoops, chimney masses, and so forth, in which there seems to be a sort of a roof sculpture interplay going on. The glass enclosure that we see is an orchid garden, which is one of the owner's hobbies of growing flowers. Here we see it from the main entry drive as we approach, the main residence being to the right, the entry for the visitor being right exactly in the center, and then the automobile parking area, the garage doors being hidden from view to a large extent by the earthen berm. To the south, the screen enclosure looks out toward green grass area, which in turn leads to a distant glade with a very beautiful view through the forest. The upward projecting towers here have ventilators, and they're specially designed to introduce light into the corners, those two corners of the building. Here's a view of the deck. The swimming pool is seen very clearly in view there, and a wooden deck which is covered with a very large extension, the roof extension. In this particular case, it's very pleasant to sit out of doors much of the year. However, the insects sometimes are terrifically bad, and you need the insect screen. And on the other hand, it often rains. And, of course, it's not very nice to sit in a rocking chair when it's raining. So this, again, is an extension of the living pattern of the owners. From the interiors looking out, we're seeing the clerestory there, which introduces a south light directly into the living room during the winter months. And we're seeing it here. This photograph was taken about a month ago. At midsummer, there's no sun, of course, that penetrates at all. The due south orientation we purposely arranged because of the desire to get a maximum amount of heat in to heat our swimming pool. The water temperature there, the normal water temperature is about 72 degrees. That's a little bit chilly for swimming. Another project that we're working on at the present time is a hillside site in Tallahassee, Florida, in which we're stepping down the hillside in a series of, these are wooden cubes, which have a certain affinity for some of the other projects you've just seen. It's a $3.2 million conference center consisting of large meeting rooms and very small seminar rooms, and then finally offices for the administration. You can see a series of pergolas, of gardens, of indoor meeting areas as well as outdoor meeting areas, all of which are put together with a strong emphasis on the preservation of the existing trees in the site, only 33% of which are represented by the cedar-rolled trees in this model. It was so dense that we couldn't take a photograph of the model. There were so many existing trees preserved. This building is one of the our last three examples that we're going to show you tonight of some things we've been working on, and I think this and the succeeding two buildings probably express as well as anything I can think of the work that we have been undertaking now for almost 2 decades. This is the result of winning an AIA open competition. We're looking at a 2-square block building, which is the Police Administration Building in Jacksonville, Florida. The building consists of 3 parts. It's very low in profile, primarily, and I think that's why it won the competition. What it does is to create an urban park on the roofscape, which is approximately, it's 2 to 3 stories high. This area of our city is growing very rapidly, and as high-rise buildings in the years ahead group themselves around the square, will have in effect a kind of a plaza that has a very pleasant view down. The second part of the building, after the rooftop terraces, becomes the interior areas of the police facilities themselves, and finally on the very lowest most area is the parking facility. You can see the fountain, by the way, on the rooftop, and the helipad and the other special appointments of the building. This is one of the pedestrian access ways to the roof. It is indicative, again, I think, of our feeling about a building, but a building that we can walk across, and it did occur to us as we were designing it that for once maybe, you know, the citizens got to walk all over the police. And there's an idea that the sheriff and I talked about sometime later, so we didn't play it up very much. The gardens themselves are more easily approached or more easily gotten to than many of the areas of the building, and for good reason. The building is designed to be very secure for obvious reasons. The night lighting is a very specially designed feature of the building. We feel that if we're going to have pleasant places in urban areas,
that making citizens not only safe, but giving them a psychological feeling that they are safe, of their well-being, that we think it's a very important idea, letting people know they're welcome day and night. The building, the rooftop never closes. This is an interior sunlighted, skylighted public service area of the building, one end of the building. At the opposite end is another larger interior court, and these are connected by an interconnecting balcony way, which is seen here. We're in the balcony looking down toward a sort of pedestrian street that leads right through the center of the building. The banners that are hung there in the skylight give some idea of the vertical scale. The banners haven't been executed by the second grade students, by the way, of the local county school group at the instigation of our office, and we had the banners hung. The whole idea that light would become the principal light emphasizing the circulation areas, the two courtyards and their connecting link, and all of these being sunlighted. This is an underlying concern of ours, that the major expression of the building is really the public street, is really the sense of the public place, and that the greatest amount of light and the greatest amount of interest is concentrated in those areas. A second building of our recently completed three is this state office building in downtown Jacksonville. We're looking down from a higher building. We're seeing a 5-story office building which has a series of riverfront terraces looking toward us, that's southward toward the St. Johns River. And then all of this is placed over a 600-car parking facility. There are about 150,000 square feet of offices in the state office building. The parking facility is a municipally, that is city-owned, the building is state-owned, and the rooftop belongs to all the people. The canopy that's in the forecourt there is a shelter for a stage area. The stage itself serves the purpose of a bus shelter for a bus drop-off at the main entry down below. The projecting browse around the building are actually sunscreens, but at the same time they have a structural purpose as well as, I think, a very clear definition of the architectural character of the building. They're quite consistent. We're seeing here from the west elevation, the ends of the buildings are entirely blank to the east and west to give us a minimum energy demand in the building. We're seeing the north elevation here, the offices that face in that direction, and again with their protective sun brows. And then finally down below, the intersecting bridge approach ramps go right through the building. They penetrate right through the parking areas, as you can see here. Seen from the one end, we get a somewhat closer view of this stepping up and stepping back. The building, needless to say, has almost no shadow, and it is approachable by ramps from different areas of the city, different quarters, different directions, so the people in the process of approaching the building find themselves on the level that they want to go to. Here during a ceremony on the under the great canopy, one looks back toward the building, and you get some idea. The skylighted balustrades on either side of the central steps on the outside of the building, which we're seeing there, is reflected on the inside. Again, the balustrades, the skylight, the sense of movement. If you're acquainted at all with the Spanish steps in Rome, you might have that same feeling of terrace progression, movement up, turning in, movement down, and movement through. Just a wonderful place to be. We purposely designed the building like this to open it up, to let people see each other, and it is working very well. the reliance on the elevators is going down very much, and most of the employees of the building prefer to be in the stairwell. They can see each other, and it's a very charming place to be. At the same time, the alcoves on either side of the central space, and here one is shown, are little quiet conversation areas, which in turn lead out to the main terraces, so that from this area we can look out and see the river and have a quiet conversation with our friend. And although it's a hustling and bustling state office building, there's a place for an individual human being to find a moment to be quiet and to himself or with his friend. We think that's very important. The texture is of concrete. It's expressed precisely as concrete. It's a bearing structure, and this bearing wall and beam system is very much an integral part of it. The final of our trilogy is the Federal Courts Building it's a federal office and U.S. Courts Building in Fort Lauderdale, which we're seeing here. We're seeing a rooftop view, and as we look down into the interior of the open rectangular space, we see a series of volumes of cubes. There are 4 in number, which have landscaped tops. These are the courts themselves. They're expressed as that. The court's function occupies only about 30% of the total square footage of the building, but nonetheless, these courts are expressed for their functions and visually as a part of their architecture as to where they are within the building. Seen from Broward Boulevard here, this is the corner of Northwest 3rd. The First Baptist Church of the city of Fort Lauderdale, which is something of a landmark, is on the right, and we can see that the building, the Federal Courts Building across the way, organizes itself in such a way that the space comes out directly at that important corner. The major entries are directly off of the corner, and the space is formed by receding and projecting masses of the various office floors throughout the building. I might say that this building, again, has the same elements as the preceding 2, the public gardens on top, the office space in the middle, and the parking on the bottom. We have been asked about the costs of such things, and I'd like to point out that this building, which had a budget of $14.5 million, came in $4 million under the budget. And the state office building, which was bid at almost the same time, this was fast track, and the state office building was straight bid. It was bid $3 million under on $11.8 million. The low bid was $8.8 million. So I think if anybody tells you that gardens and places for people have to be expensive or they're unnecessary, so forth, I think maybe there's another side to that coin. What we're seeing here is the dark areas are actually water courses. The water is tumbling down over these pyramids of water. We're seeing the terraces up above there as they step down. They step down in irregular patterns, receding as they come down in this particular elevation. This is the elevation to the east. From the balconies, what we have done there is we've shaded the glass so deeply with these projecting balconies that the sun never touches the glass, and consequently our air conditioning load from the beginning was greatly reduced, which meant that we could reduce the tonnage of air conditioning required, and of course that has a dramatic reduction of cost of initial construction cost, but it also means, of course, that the energy budget is quite low. The stepping back occurs to the left in 30-foot horizontal step backs, that to the right in 10-foot, and those we can see on the right-hand side as we go around to the north elevation. The building is sculpted there in proportion to the 5-story height and the overall length of the building, which here is 350 feet, so that by stepping back at 20-foot intervals, we're working with a 10 by 10 base system, so it's always multiples of 10 feet. We can shape the building and create its spaces and create its open and closed areas and its masses, and let the building speak to us of something it's all about. This, of course, in the one way of looking at it is perhaps not the typical federal office building. On the other hand, it seems to me it has columns and a great podium and a very simple horizontal line that carries all the way around, and an expression, a consistent expression of the same structural members bearing concrete where concrete in fact is bearing. The same kind of thing we find, I think, historically through many buildings. Here at a dedication ceremony, we get some ideas. We're moving in around the pools, the handicapped ramp, as well as the main entry stairs in the foreground here lead in through pools of water on either side, sometimes placid and sometimes running very quickly like cataracts, making a kind of background sound to dampen the street noises and give a separation to the interior courts area so that we don't we have a visual connection with the street, and yet we have something of an acoustical separation. I think the people here show exactly where the terraces are, and you can see the terraces go up and up on the inside. Looking down from one of the upper levels, we see the projection of spaces. The building was actually designed in a subtractive fashion. That is, we took away from it. We did it mostly through models. And we found that by assembling a great enough volume, we could begin to take away the parts from the greater volume rather than putting together and building the volume up, making the sculpture. I don't know whether you followed that or not, but it was made too big and then subtractions were made. It was something of a new way, and I might say that that's one of the curiosities for us, I guess. Just about every project that we come up with, we hope to find, to explore further, to find more, to probe more deeply. And if we go through the whole project and haven't learned anything, I haven't done anything differently, we think we're not learning very much. I love this particular photograph here. It reminds me a little of Monte Alban. I don't know about your favorite buildings or sites in the world, but after the ones that I've seen in the few places I have been fortunate enough to go in the world, I think that Monte Alban is one that I perhaps have enjoyed the most. It's a series of very simply set volumes in space, a very lovely sight, and it has seems to have something to do with the sky. It has something to do with the light of the sun, the matter of ascending, and a sense of resolution, a sense of presence, a sense of place, a sense of something that has a very timeless quality. It's something that's it's one of those things that's very personal, but something I personally love very much. The interiors of the space, these are some of the courtrooms. The building here was dedicated to a very wonderful public servant, Paul Rogers. I took Congressman Rogers into the spaces during the ceremonies of dedication a few months ago. He drew forward into the court and he said, "Gee, this is what a room should be. This is what a federal court should be, not filled with the trappings, the pompousness of so many courts, but rather one in which it's almost like a library in which there's a sense of fairness that's going to pervade." And I thought for a congressman, I thought, gee, what a terrific sense of feeling of architecture, because of course that's exactly what we did. The trappings of the court are the human beings who are there, and they're expressed exactly for that purpose. That is, the rooms. They're very, very quietly done. The emphasis is on people and on the concentration, almost on library-like atmosphere of the findings of truth, which is a very serious matter. And here you can see the jury box to the left, and the attorney's tables, and then the witness box, the judges stand, and so forth. So from the exterior of the building in the evening, again, the familiar night lighting pattern that combination of the vertical trees, the slender columns that rise, cantilevering each tree so that it does not touch the next, leaving horizontal chases for distribution of mechanical systems throughout the building, consistent repetition of a single form throughout, in the one sense a very simple, repetitive building, in the other sense having something to do with a kind of an accidentalism, of having alternatives that are always unfolding, and sort of wondering what these alternatives can mean for us. So I think with that, and having seen that our last project, I'd like to go back to the very first slide and recall that we're talking about a view of the earth, about a view of the world, about looking out at a horizon and seeing a thing that our parents had never seen, and now we take for granted, and we will live dreams that they had would not even have occurred to them. And it seems to me that what each of us is going to be doing in the next few years, the next few decades maybe, I think none of us really knows. I think we're off in a way on a great quest. There are quite a few new directions that are coming before us. They're developing quickly, and they all have great meaning and terrific potential. Which one is right, we don't know. But we do know that there are some great adventures to be had. And I think that at this particular time in architecture is one of the most adventurous and exciting times that we've ever had. And I hope that your voyage in architecture is going to be as much fun as mine has been. Thank you.
The title of Mr. Morgan's presentation was, as I mentioned, Recent Work. What we have seen actually is a result of a work of the last few weeks of an office of only 6 professionals. Much of the architecture we have seen here in slide form seems to be particularly appropriate and sympathetic to the climatic and other conditions of Florida. On the other hand, I think that we here in the Midwest can adopt much of it. Some of the projects we have seen don't seem to be exactly low-cost housing projects. But I think principles applied certainly can be utilized right here also in our area. I think we have probably a few questions for Mr. Morgan, and he has agreed to answer them here, and after this in our area. The second question after asking mine is here, Professor Whitney Gordon. Well, it's the first question. So, Bill?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Fascinating Viceroy. I wonder if you might go out on how you attempt to relate to the built environment around you. I raise the question of the built environment because Florida, as with much of the United States, was perhaps infamous for its block New England churches, its McDonald's, etc. Obviously, you have to confront that problem. How should we?
Well, I think that the built environment is, awfully important. I think getting along with it, too, is one of the great things that we're trying to learn about. I was fortunate enough when, just after I graduated,